All right, everybody, welcome back. This is topic 1.3, which will cover aquatic biomes. In topic 1.2, we spent some time talking about terrestrial biomes. So I'm going to make two videos here dealing with aquatic biomes, so biomes that deal with water. Before we get into this, there's a couple goals that I want to make sure we understand. We want to try to achieve while we go through these videos. Number one, we should be able to kind of tell the difference, kind of contrast different types of biomes, aquatic biomes, both freshwater and also saltwater. We call those marine biomes, and also kind of understand some of the threats, some of the anthropogenic things that people do to negatively impact these aquatic biomes. All right, so when we dealt with terrestrial biomes, we talked about a few, I guess, parameters that sort of help define the terrestrial biome. For example, temperature and precipitation. That describes climate. So there's a unique climate for each terrestrial biome, and then also latitude, which is its position on Earth in relation to the equator. Is it north of the equator, south of the equator, 30 degrees north, 60 degrees north? Where is it? And also altitude. The higher you go, the more likely you'll get climate change and a change in biome conditions. All right, so those are things that kind of help define, again, terrestrial biomes. Now, aquatic is a little bit different. Typically with aquatic, we look at three things. There's a few more, but these are three of the big ones. One of them is salinity. That means salt water. Is it salt water or is it not salt water? Sometimes it's kind of a combination of both. We'll talk about that in the next video. Depth of the water. Is it like super deep or is it super shallow? And also water flow. Is it a moving body of water or is it a stationary body of water like a lake, for example? All right, so this slide here kind of breaks it down for you, and this I think is a good thing to study as far as just understanding all the different types of aquatic biomes. We initially kind of split them up into two categories, freshwater and marine. This video is going to be about freshwater, and then the second one will be about marine. So we're going to cover today these three biomes on the left here: lakes and ponds, streams and rivers, and freshwater wetlands. They're the ones that make up, again, the freshwater aquatic biomes. And again, in the next video, we'll cover all the marine ones. So I won't go over those today. All right, now freshwater biomes, we'll start with streams and rivers. The biggest thing here, these are free flowing. Okay? They're not stationary, they're not um, non-moving bodies of water. They definitely flow, right? As far as the difference between a stream and a river, there really isn't much difference, other than typically rivers are bigger. There's more volume. As far as the amount of water goes, but typically it's just a size thing, and there really is no general rule that says, hey, how big does it have to be a river? How small does it have to be a stream? Streams typically flow into rivers, if that maybe helps a little bit. But we're going to kind of talk about both of them kind of in the same context because they're very similar. Um, the slower the body of water moves, typically it will have more plant life. So kind of keep that in mind. A lot of times streams move fairly quickly, so the amount of plants that can grow in them is kind of limited. But that does have an impact on plant life as far as water flow goes. The faster the flow, the more likely you are to have rapids. Rapids are like the white water on top of the river. The thing about rapids is it allows more oxygen to get into the water, and that's good for fish, right? Because fish like to breathe in oxygen. So the more rapids there are, typically the more oxygen there will be in the water. So again, the flow of the water does impact the living things that are in it. So I guess the speed of the river could be an abiotic factor for the living things that are in the water. Typical couple pictures here. This would probably be, I guess, considered a stream. Guys standing in. It's kind of a shallow body of water, but it might be moving fairly quickly. This here might be a river. It's much bigger. You can maybe see a little bit of the rapids, on top of the water. But again, they're both fairly similar bodies of water because they do flow. All right, lakes and ponds. Again, same type of thing. What makes it a lake? What makes it a pond? The biggest thing is size. Again, we're going to kind of talk about both of these in the same context. Um, Lakes and ponds are standing bodies of water. There typically will be a stream or a river flowing into it, but again, that will be the standing body of water, the actual lake or the pond. It says here, some, or at least part of the lake or pond, is too deep to support what we call emergent vegetation. Emergent means that these are plants that are rooted to the bottom and they grow through the surface. Okay. A lake or a pond definitely has some part of it that is too deep for that to occur. All right, so that's kind of one of the big parameters that kind of, I guess, defines lakes and ponds is there will be an area of that body of water that can't support any of that emergent vegetation. All right, a little bit of anatomy of a lake, some terms that you should know. The next slide, I think, kind of describes each one a little bit more, but just kind of looking at this, here's a typical either pond or small lake, whatever you want. We'll start here in the back where it says riparian zone. The riparian zone is basically the land that just edges up to the lake. It's a land zone. It's not aquatic. All right. So I mean, this particular area here in the back, this is all the riparian zone. Kind of like the shoreline, I suppose you can kind of consider that. Now, once we get into the body of water, we have an area called the littoral zone. The littoral zone is the shallow area. Usually you can stand in it, maybe it's 3, 4, 5 feet deep. Definitely in the littoral zone, you can have some emergent vegetation. If you look here, there's some plants growing in the littoral zone, like some cattails or whatever, but it's shallow enough for emergent vegetation to grow. You get out a little bit deeper, and you get out into something called the limnetic zone. Now, the limnetic zone, you're not going to see any emergent vegetation. All right. Instead, what you'll have in this area is a lot of algae, a lot of aquatic plants that don't have to root themselves. So they're kind of free floating algae. The limnetic zone goes pretty deep. It'll go down as far as sunlight will penetrate. So there's some factors that determine that, like how murky the lake is and all that stuff. But the limnetic zone might go down 25, 30, 40 feet, depending on, again, the type of lake that it is. But eventually, sunlight cannot penetrate past a certain point. And that's where the limnetic zone ends and something called the profundal zone begins. The profundal zone is the area of the lake, the water area where it is complete darkness. There is no sunlight that can penetrate down there. So you're not going to find any plants down here. Or you might find some animals, but you won't find any plants because, again, they can't photosynthesize. Now, the very bottom of the lake or pond, it's the, kind of like the actual, like soil at the bottom, is called the benthic zone. Now, the benthic zone could be up here in the shallow area. As long as it's the bottom, it's benthic, but it can go all the way down here to the bottom as well in the profundal zone. That's usually loaded with decomposers, is usually very nutrient rich. Because think about it, anything that dies up here in the limnetic zone is most likely going to sink all the way down to the benthic. and that's where all the nutrients are, all the decomposition takes place in the lake. So make sure we know these lake zones. Okay, you guys can copy this into your notes, study that, but you do need to know the different types. I very well also could show you just a picture of a lake like this, and have you point to me, hey, where would the limnetic zone be? Where would the riparian zone be? Where would all the decomposers live in the lake? That type of thing. So we should be able to again, kind of dissect the anatomy of a lake and understand kind of what goes on in each one of these zones. So make sure that you read over those notes. All right. A couple other things here about ponds and lakes. There's typically a couple of different categories of lakes or ponds. We call them either oligotrophic, mesotrophic, or eutrophic. And the big difference between them is plant life. We call that productivity. The more plants there are, the more productive the ecosystem is, or the more productive the lake is. Less plants means less productivity. So oligotrophic and eutrophic are kind of the two extremes, and then mesotrophic is kind of a hybrid of the two. So a couple things I want you to know about these. Again, I would study this stuff. Oligotrophic are typically very deep lakes. There are some lakes where they're 200 feet deep. They're extremely deep lakes. Some lakes are much shallower. Probably like Cedar Lake, for example. I don't know the deepest part of Cedar Lake, but I'm going to guess it's probably maybe 30 feet, maybe at the deepest. So that would probably be a much shallower lake. Okay. Um, Oligotrophic lakes are usually very nutrient poor. There's not a lot of nutrients in the lake, whereas eutrophic lakes are typically very nutrient rich. Oligotrophic typically has very little algae. Those are plants. So in an oligotrophic lake, we don't have a lot of that. Whereas in a eutrophic lake, they're typically kind of greenish. There's usually a lot of algae, a lot of phytoplankton, and a lot of plant life growing in those lakes. Oligotrophic lakes are usually pretty clear, again, because there's probably not a lot of algae growing in there, whereas eutrophic lakes are usually a little bit more murky. We call that turbid, where the visibility in the lake might be a little bit less, let's say, in an oligotrophic lake. This is kind of a big one. Oxygen content. Think about what uses oxygen in a lake, right? Fish do. So, for example, an oligotrophic lake, it's typically very high in oxygen content. And the reason why it's so high is because there's not a lot of decomposers in a lake. Decomposers actually use oxygen. So if there's no decomposers using the oxygen, there will be a lot of oxygen available for fish, right? That kind of makes sense. In a eutrophic lake, there's less oxygen. I'm not saying that there's no oxygen, there is, but it's usually much less. And that usually means that the fish that live in those lakes have to be adapted to survive with a lower oxygen content in the lake. All right, so I mean you can have a lot of fish in a eutrophic lake, but they're kind of limited, because there's not as much oxygen as there would be in an oligotrophic lake. Oligotrophic, the bottom is usually pretty rocky or sandy. And I mean, if you walked on it or walked on the bottom of the lake, you would feel it with your feet, the rocks and things like that. Whereas eutrophic, it's usually very mucky, kind of muddy. A lot of that is because of all the decomposition that's taking place in the lake. And a mesotrophic lake is kind of in between the two. Most lakes, be honest with you, most lakes are mesotrophic. They're kind of a hybrid between the two. But if we kind of understand the two extremes, then we should understand perfectly well that most lakes kind of fit into both categories. We consider those to be mesotrophic. One problem that we're seeing, and this is kind of an anthropogenic thing, is we're seeing a lot of oligotrophic lakes turning into eutrophic lakes. We have a special name for this. It's called cultural eutrophication. Eutrophication is where an oligotrophic lake turns into a eutrophic lake, and this is typically done because human activity at the surface is driving this to occur. If you look at this picture here on the left, we've got a fairly deep lake, nice and clear, not a lot of algae growing in it. This is typically an oligotrophic situation over here on the left. But over on the right, you'll notice that there's some changes over here. This is the same body of water, but here's kind of the variable. This is decades of time. This might be 20, 30, 40 years. So let's see what's happened here, right? We've got like a little city that's kind of been built up here on the, on the banks of the lake. You've got a factory that was built. You've got a farm over here with farm animals, and all of these things produce waste that can get into this lake. For example, a lot of construction goes on to build a city, right? And a lot of those sediments that are left over from the construction, a lot of that stuff ends up going into the lake. You'll notice how the lake is a lot, shallower now than what it might have been, let's say 30 or 40 years ago. A lot of it's because of that runoff of all of that sediment. Another thing too that happens is you get a lot of nutrients that run off typically from farms or from houses. And when those nutrients get into the lake, that causes algae to bloom. Remember back when we talked about the Neuse River, right? I mean, algae love nutrients. As soon as they get all those things in the lake, then they're going to start blooming. So that's kind of why you see kind of the difference in color here. But this happens all the time, and we have 7.6 billion people, and we're going to have a heck of a lot of this going on because a lot of these sediments and nutrients are running off into eutrophic bodies of water. All right, wetlands. This is kind of the last one I want to talk about today. A wetland is a shallow body of water that can support emergent plants all year. So this is shallow is kind of a key thing here. This is not deep. All right, most of the time this is going to be just maybe a couple of feet, but throughout the entire body of water, emergent plants. So these are plants that can root themselves on the bottom and they can grow through the surface. All right, that's typically what a wetland is. Now, there's three different categories of wetlands: swamps, marshes, and bogs. So I'm going to kind of just explain the difference between the three. This is a swamp. The biggest thing you see here in this swamp, this is shallow water. You see some emergent plants, right? But these are trees. So if you've got emergent trees, you've got a swamp. Okay. A lot of swamps are in the southern part of our country. We have a lot of swamps down in like Louisiana. There's some in Florida, Alabama, those places. We don't see a lot of them up here in Northwest Indiana. Marshes, we do see a lot of marshes in Northwest Indiana. Marshes contain non-woody plants, so no trees. All right. Typically, these are things like lily pads and cattails and some types of grasses that can grow through the wetland. But again, this is kind of a different picture here compared to this one. Okay. Here we have the trees. Here we just have what we call non-woody plants. And then we have bogs. The thing about bogs is typically you'll find them in areas where you have a lot of evergreens, a lot of like spruce trees, trees that have needles. Though, and those are found mostly in northern latitudes. So you'll see a lot of bogs in like Canada, the Pacific Northwest, maybe northern Michigan, Minnesota. You might see some of these things. So you'll see a lot of evergreen trees around the bog. The thing about those evergreen trees, again, they have needles. And when those needles fall, it makes the water very acidic. So this is a much different condition of living for plants compared to the other two things. One of the kind of hallmarks of a bog is something called peat moss. Peat moss is a plant that really does well living in acidic conditions. So you won't see a lot of peat moss in a swamp or a marsh, but you'll see a lot of it in bogs. Okay. In fact, you can even buy, they call it sphagnum moss. You can buy it at like Home Depot. They use it as like ground cover and things like that, but whatever. All right. Last couple things here about wetlands. Here we have a typical wetland here, on this picture. And the thing about a wetland is there's always going to be an input of water, like a stream that'll flow into it. And there's usually going to be an output, like a little stream that flows away from it. But the wetland is kind of the middle, where all the water kind of saturates and kind of just stays. But imagine like what would happen if we built a Walmart over this, or we built a golf course, over this or something. I mean, there are some really, really important aspects of a wetland. Wetlands have a couple of really important things. One of them is they help to reduce flooding. The wetland can hold a lot of water. So if you remove the wetland, typically that will increase flooding near any town or community that might be near it. So that's a really, real big problem. Another thing wetlands do is they filter out pollutants. I'm going to go back to this picture. Let's say, for example, this stream is flowing in to the wetland. Let's say that stream is carrying with it some toxins or some poisonous chemicals. Well, what will happen is a lot of those chemicals will end up just kind of sinking to the bottom of the wetland, and then out the other end will come fresh water. So this kind of acts as sort of a filtration system for any bad stuff that might be coming into it. So if you remove it, then you remove its ability to filter the water. So that's kind of an important thing we want to make sure that we don't remove. And then finally, probably one of the most important things is it's a habitat. Lots of living things, depend on wetlands. A lot of times the wetland will act as the breeding grounds for a lot of birds, migratory species. And if you remove that, then they won't have anywhere to breed. So that's kind of a big problem as well. So make sure we know, some of those importances. A few more threats here. This kind of an important thing. It says only about 5% of the nation's land is made up of wetlands. So we don't have a lot of these areas. And what we do have, this is kind of what we're doing. We've been draining water out of them to use it for agricultural purposes like farming. So we're removing all the water out. We're building dams that kind of block the inflow of water into them. That's usually not a good thing. A lot of commercial and urban development around them or on top of them, which completely removes them, which is not good. And finally, we're dumping things into them. This picture here at the bottom kind of shows you the result of what happens if you just keep dumping garbage into a wetland. It just accumulates, and obviously that's not a good thing either. All right, we'll stop here today, folks. Tomorrow's video or the next video will be on the marine biomes. All right, thank you. Have a good day.